Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, June 30th of 2020, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is July 5th, 2020. Each Tuesday, we simply call in from wherever we may be, our homes, our travels, our hotels, at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time, and our little team will be working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A. And if you're focusing on the Gospel Lectionary this week or preparing for a virtual discussion group during the pandemic, we hope this will provide areas of focus and reflection. And here's our approach. We work independently in advance of the call-in with some preliminary information or questions on what the lead-off person on the call would like to discuss, and then we develop perspectives, share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Bill Hall.
Sara Mickelson.
Charles Willard.
And I'm Don Upton. And our friend Bill Hall is going to kick off our approach to scripture reading. And then we'll go to Charles Willard for a little background on what they would have heard during the first century. But first, I'll say hello to my friend Bill.
Thank you, Don, and good morning, Sarah and Charles, and welcome to those listening and watching later. We're glad to have you as a part of the conversation. In a moment, we're going to be reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, and we're going to read all of the passage from 16 to the end of the chapter, verse 30. Just a brief comment on that. In the lectionary, they leave out verses 20 through 24. And it may well be Sunday that our pastors leave that out. That's what the lectionary provides. I'm including it for several reasons. First of all, it is a part of the narrative. It is the way Matthew and however the editing process for that gospel went, the writer or writers of this gospel chose for their own reasons to include it. The other is, I think it is yet another example of the lectionary's tendency to try to avoid the tough passages. It doesn't avoid them all, but you will hear in a moment when this is read, there's a, whatever word you want to use, perhaps even a harshness to this. And I was interested recently listening to Walter Brueggemann on a live Zoom, who raised a concern about the lectionaries avoiding the tough subjects and saying, in effect, especially in today's world, we need to stop avoiding the tough issues. So, in a moment, we will read this. The four of us are going to read the following sections, and I will begin. This is the word of the Lord. Let us listen. Jesus is speaking. But to what will I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another, saying, we played the flute for you and you did not dance. We wailed and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds.
Then he began to reproach the cities in which most of his deeds of power had been done, because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the deeds of power done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, on the day of judgment, it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? No, you will be brought down to Hades. For if the deeds of power done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I tell you that on the day of judgment, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom than for you.
At that time, Jesus said, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you've hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent, and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to thee by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone whom the Son chooses to reveal him.
Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying a heavy burden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Charles, would you like to share with us some initial observations?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bill. Just a couple of observations. One is we have learned that the three Gospels, called the Synoptic Gospels, generally have used two kinds of resources. One is the Gospel of Mark, which tended to be to set the framework, and the other is a document which is imagined because of the way texts in Luke and Matthew appear, but no one has ever seen it. It's called the Q document, for reasons that I'm not going to go into right now, but it's a document that is alluded to because Luke and Matthew seem to use it to, I'm going to say fill out, but to provide additional material for their presentation of Jesus. The reason I'm calling particular attention to that now is that we need to keep in mind, as Bill has suggested already, we have to keep in mind that these Gospels are not transcripts of sayings and presentations and sermons and lectures and dialogues that Jesus had that were then carefully written down at the time that they were occurred and preserved for us. Rather, they are the reconstruction by these three separate writers, whom we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are reconstructed many years after they occurred. And what we have is a reconstruction that was not intended to recreate life as it exactly had occurred, but to recreate the presentation of Jesus' life so that he would become real. Their intention was not to communicate history. Their intention was to communicate the gospel in a way that was enticing and inviting and converting, so that when we say, as we will later in this conversation, why would Jesus have said that? We need to remember that it was why did Matthew present Jesus saying these words in this fashion at this time, rather than assuming that we're getting a straight transcript of a conversation or a sermon or a lecture or an interaction that Jesus had. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. Now, I have three questions, and the first one I'll read in just a moment. My hope is to consider the passage as a whole, but particularly to focus on the section that the lectionary leaves out, the woes that Don read for us. In just a moment, we're going to start with Don. But taking the passage as a whole, including the excluded portion by the lectionary, Jesus is clearly both confronting and comforting his listeners. Stanley Saunders, a biblical professor at Columbia Seminary, Decatur, Georgia, says in his article on this, quote, Matthew persistently affirms that God's empire, embodied in the proclamation and teaching of Jesus, brings both judgment and salvation, both healing and division. So it's both and, looking at the passage as a whole. This section in verses 20 to 24, again, whatever words we want to use, it's about judgment, it's about confronting, there's perhaps even we might consider a harshness to it. So, Don, I'll begin with you. How do you understand and how would you apply the message of verses 20 to 24, which the lectionary omits? What do you make of those verses, Don?
Well, thank you for including those verses. And when you first sent those questions out to the listener, we get the questions about a week in advance. I went, oh, no. And then as we began preparations for this Zoom, my friend Bill said, well, Don, you go first to answer the question. But now I want to say, oh, yes, because of just a few things. The first one is, you're asking about this being confrontational, confronting, and I like that angle. I think about three things as you go through this. So this is a difficult read. One is capability of a group of human beings, capability. The second is responsibility. And the third is mercy. I guess my theme is insert mercy. So we have the concepts of capability and responsibility and mercy, and I think that helps when you read this, especially if you're facilitating a class. And I think Christ is also talking about to think about the collective or the corporate nature of any references to cities. Later on in the passage, it becomes very personal, very individual. Right now, I think he says, consider the corporate. At least I'd say that to you if you're leading a class. Consider the corporate and the role that cities have in shaping things that we're thinking about today in a crisis of justice, systems, health, in the pandemic. And so cities were a real thing in the first century, and they had been for a long time. So the role of cities in a corporate level includes shaping. See if these words are familiar to you today. Trade, supply chains, culture, justice, health. Even in the first century, essential services, we might say utilities today. Festivals, what memorials matter, holidays, access, what you're supposed to remember. This sounds familiar to all the things going on today. And I think Jesus raised cities not just to think about corporate responsibility, collective responsibility, but to understand the power of cities. That cities, I would throw out, is neutral. And then you add something to it to see what power, what good comes out of it. When people live near each other, there's got to be rules and protocols and norms. And when they densify in large numbers, which is what we're dealing with today, just like they did then, there's a power, right, over trade, environment, wealth, and other places in its orbit. It's not just your city, but what's the neighbor city? Who's your supplier city? Friend or foe? And the powers of the city are exerted in many ways to different kinds of values and priorities, which we might forget. And I think underwritten in this is, what do you remember? What do you get up every day as a family to do, as a city family? What are the values that you have? And so I think, I'm going to stretch it out the 21st century, that the gospel is the gospel of ecosystems. The gospel is the gospel of trade. The gospel is the gospel of cities and streets. And in the first century, large cities even had sewers for those lucky enough to have them, right? And people had some people had and some people didn't. But the city had the power to make life better. So I'm going to say, insert mercy, right? So to take a city from being neutral to being something where responsibility to each other might matter. So if I say today, food and nutrition, well, that's neutral. Insert mercy. Isn't it distributed in different ways? In a city, essential needs, health practices, justice, insert mercy. Work, insert mercy. Wealth, insert mercy. Learning, trade, the role of neighboring villages and how you treat them. The visitor, those who flee, insert mercy. And then there's the upbuilding part of this, which is it's confrontational, but Bill, to your point, I think it is comforting in that of all these cities, this wide range of cities, the potential to understand responsibility, the potential to show mercy and the powers of the density of the city is there. Sure feels like the 21st century to me. How about you, Sara?
I'm right there with you. In addition to that, or how mercy is expressed, I thought about last week's conversation quite a bit as I was preparing for this particular question. Hospitality was a strong element that we talked about last week from chapter 10 of Matthew. And so hospitality is present in this passage as well. When someone does not meet our expectations, are we still interested in what they have to offer? No one is more difficult to work with than someone who feels they are completely successful alone, unteachable, no humility to offer, no weakness that needs to be shored up. And cities often have that sense of coverage. And so I wonder, I thought about this from a corporate perspective, that it's important that the corporate community be responsive with hospitality and have a way of making it easier for the citizens of the community to work together, to navigate geography, to communicate to each other, forums of communication strands. So I'm curious, here we have an exploration of cities that experienced the Messiah and yet weren't profoundly impacted. So I guess how often, in the absence of our hospitality, do we miss the good work of the Messiah and the gifts that are offered? And as a result, we are like these communities that Jesus addresses, that we profess we understand and look for the divine, but we don't treat each other like we acknowledge the divine in each other's homes. We violate privacy issues. We say for the good of the community, we have the right to bang down a door without knocking, without, this idea of the safety of all is worth, kneeling on people and causing the carotid artery to stop pumping or the windpipe to stop breathing. So I'm concerned that the arm of the community needs to look and feel like the arm of Christ and not necessarily the strong arm of order. So I kind of was indicted by that.
Thank you, Don and Sara. Charles?
Yes, I find myself puzzled while I was listening to these conversations because the towns that Jesus was commending weren't necessarily good towns. I'm not sure that they were behaving in the beneficial, beneficent, encouraging way that Don described them. Sidon and Tyre, the thing about Sidon and Tyre was that they were basically Gentile communities.
Yep. And
the comparison that Jesus was making was that these Gentile communities who didn't have the benefit of the theological reality that the Jewish communities did, nevertheless were better. But as a matter of comparison, I didn't assume that Jesus was commending them because of their good works. All he was saying was that by comparison, you're worse than they are. That's the comparison. The comparison was how poorly and how inadequately and how unopenly the so-called better Jewish communities, that was the difference. That was the difference. So they were not being commended because of their good works. It was that Jesus was making the other comparison. Compared to these towns that you think so lowly of, the truth is that you're much worse than they are. That's the comparison, not the other way around. At least that was why I was a little puzzled by both Sara, your comments, and Don's comments.
Well, and if I could, in my defense, really, my attempt was to say that in terms of comfort that Bill was raising, that the capability to examine one's responsibility in the collective environment, to understand that we have the power over systems to improve life and show mercy, was kind of an overarching point that was being made. I didn't mean to suggest that there was a value or a success that was being laid out. So thanks, Charles.
Right. No, I heard Don and Sara both lifting up the capacity for influence by the city, and to kind of build on what you said, Charles. I was going to note that Brian Stoffergen points out that the repentant towns are Gentile cities and the unrepentant are Israelite cities. It brought to mind in Luke's Gospel, chapter 4, the first sermon Jesus preaches at Nazareth. He's the hometown boy. He grew up there. He's preaching in the synagogue, and they start off loving him because he sounds like he's saying nice things. And then Jesus makes this very same kind of point, that it was during the time of Elijah and Elisha, it wasn't the Jewish people who responded well, it was Gentiles. He gives examples of it was the non-Jewish people who were receptive and received the ministry, and the people of Nazareth tried to kill him. I think it's that same kind of dynamic. Now, Tom Weir, I found a sermon by him, and he has a little fun with it, but I like the way he words this and what he brings out. So I'm going to read his quote. I wonder what these towns and villages that made Jesus so angry. I searched to find out about Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida to see if there was anything notorious about them, the ones that he's announcing woes to. According to Weir, they were all nondescript little fishing villages in Galilee, the small villages where most of the disciples came from. Nothing in the gospel points toward these villages being full of brothels, drugs, gangs, hedonists, communists, or devil worshippers. Apparently, Jesus' main complaint is that they were apathetic whiners. Jesus had preached and healed, what Matthew called acts of power, and they were unmoved, going on about the business of catching fish. Jesus compares them to children in the marketplace, that nothing you do will please me. Now, I'm not going to insist that Weir's interpretation is correct, but it kind of resonated with me that I think what Jesus is confronting is when something is offered to you, obviously we have a choice. And the indictment, at least potentially, is that offered the good news, they just shrugged and said, well, that's not entertaining enough. It's like I can imagine some evaluations over Sunday dinner about the pastor's sermon. Was it? I've heard some of those. Growing up, and you can imagine. And sometimes instead of talking about the essence of the message and how it applies to me, we're evaluating the messenger rather than dealing with the message. And some messages it's okay to reject. In fact, in some ways, that's a better kind of response than apathy. Now, I think, again, we can't know for certain why that's there, but I appreciate those sharings. Now, we're going to move to question number 2, and Sara, give you a heads up, I'm going to go to you first. Verse 28 says, come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Based on the passage, and verse 28 in particular, how do you understand and how have you experienced the rest that Jesus promises, especially in light of our current COVID-19 and our racial justice challenges? Sara?
So it's a cartoon, and in the cartoon there are characters standing in front of what looks to be a chalkboard grid or maybe an NFL fantasy draft card. And there are some things written in the column, like that might be row descriptions, and there are things written across the top that might be column descriptions. And the person that's writing on the chalkboard goes, okay, who had Saharan dust on their card? And so it's as if on this cartoon you can see different kinds of catastrophic unrest, racial divide, earthquake, tornado, hurricane. So across the top are the natural disasters, and then down the side are what are called social disasters like COVID-19 and healthcare systems that are inadequate, or distribution of food and services. So it's almost as if they were doing a cartoon about the terrible things that could happen in 2020. And they said, okay, who had Saharan dust storm? And, this idea that 2020 has presented specifically to the world, but addressing every community with a different kind of crisis. So I put the word anxiety into this particular phrase, and that when you're anxious, even if you lay down, you can't rest. When you're anxious, even if you get up and walk around and try to keep your mind busy and give it puzzles to solve, your mind doesn't rest. So I look at the word rest in this particular phrase and think about what it's like to live without anxiety. What might it be like to lay down your worry, to lay down the need to stabilize and control, or at least give some semblance of control? And when we perceive and project that we have everything under control, I think that we are deceiving ourselves and deceiving others. And I think with this particular part of the passage, Jesus encourages us to lay that down, to offer the action to Him, and wait for the pieces to fall apart together, or fall together apart. That rest comes from faithful action and assurance, and not something we earn. And it comes to us when we look to God as the director of exercise of our life, and acknowledge that each opportunity, negative or positive, brings with it gifts. And we want to be aware and acknowledge those gifts instead of just be distracted by the catastrophe. So who had Saharan desert dust on their card?
Good. Thank you, Sara. Don?
I struggled with this question because my answer a few days ago would have been, I don't know the answer. And I was caught up in the first question. So I was thinking about the mercy power of cities and the collective, and I had to shift. It took me a minute to shift. It took me days to shift to the personal. But we have the first section you asked about, which was collective, and how we reflect on the systems and our responsibility to each other, and how we even deliver basic essential services to each other. And that was true in the first century. And then the mercy power. And then this is, I got into it when I made it more personal. And so when I got personal, it had a problem for me, Bill, because I thought, well, rest is subjective. Rest is personal. Rest is contextual. So who am I? Who am I to say I need rest? Who are you? It's all different, isn't it? But that was the key, that it is subjective. It is contextual. So when I was thinking about the city, it's an ecosystem, and the gospel works in the ecosystem to provide health and nutrition and love And Christ asked us to reflect on that. And then when we go to the rest, I reflect on that. And the way it broke through for me is at first I was going, well, I would not stand up and say that I need rest. Maybe I should not worry about that. You need rest. There are those who suffer. There are those who flee. There are those serious with anxiety. Well, I'm doing all right today. I don't need rest. But that's not true. And so this whole piece of the gospel became this ecosystem thing. And here's two simple examples. I chose to fly. Some people may scold me for that the other day. We're in the middle of a pandemic, but this weekend I flew. I was exhausted when that was over because of all the steps we had to go through. And whether other people are more exhausted than me, I was tired and I need rest. The pilot, the first person you think needs rest. The crew needs rest. The baggage handler needs rest. I need rest. There's a whole world involved in travel that needs rest, and we depend on each other. We can reflect on what each of us need when it comes to the personal, contextual rest. And Christ talks about that, the rest, even in travel. If I'd say, who needs rest if someone's in prison? There's a whole ecosystem. If you're in solitary confinement, you still need rest. And those that are there around you and serve you food needs rest. The writer needs rest. The roofer needs rest. And the other example would be in surgery. Most of all, I think the surgeon needs rest, but so does the patient. So does the family waiting to hear news of the success of the surgery. So do the people that make sure the room is sterile. So do the administrators and the people that process the insurance. So I broke away from the collective of a city, a merciful, powerful city, but it also brought it back to understanding of rest and the collective nature and the individual nature of the need for rest and the gospel of rest as Jesus travels and instructs those around him to think about each other and their own hearts. That was the best I could do with it, Bill.
Good. Thank you, Sara and Don. For me, it brought to mind a time in my life. Some years ago, I had been served as the organizing pastor of a new church, and in spite of the pastor, it grew. We built in a great location, and staff grew in membership, and being the kind of person that I am, I was trying to cover all the bases and really feeling truly burdened because it seemed to be getting away from me. And in the providence of God, I was asked to do a wedding for a couple who lived at opposite ends of the U.S. but were grounded in Braden, and they wanted a wedding there. So we had to work for months, and they would arrange a time to fly in together, and we would have a premarital counseling session. Brilliant young couple, and it was a delightful wedding. At the last session, the bride handed me a book and said, listening to you, I think this would help you. And it was Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I thanked her and put it down. And a year later, one night about 10 o'clock at home, I picked it up and started reading. And I was up all night long reading that book. It truly transformed my life, helping me find some rest. And I mean that truly. And there are many ways, and I'm not going to, but it isn't time to go over all of them. But habits 1 and 2, begin with the end in mind and put first things first. And it was a revelation to me how scattered I was. As I began to share this with others, just one example of considered a criticism or an observation was that I was reluctant truly to delegate. I would, and then I kept being over involved. So there were a number of things that I needed to work on personally, but my application would be, and I will say a little more about this in the third question about the yoke. When I put first things first in my faith life and in my life, that means, first of all, I can't do everything. I cannot help everybody. I cannot save anybody. I can only deal with my behavior. So it challenges any sense of grandiosity. And when I understand as best I can the call of the gospel on my life and make that my priority, there is a kind of rest that comes. There's a focus. Now, not arrogant, doesn't mean I've got a full grip on it, but there have been some times in my life where controversies occurred. For example, in this forming new church, when things were going well, the AIDS crisis exploded, and we made our facility available for a support group for persons with AIDS. And we lost some members of the church because we were letting those people in the church. Now, it was led by professionals, and it was a powerful support group. And there are many stories that go with that. But there was, for me, in the midst of that controversy, and even for the session, a kind of peace. We knew that we were, to the best of our ability, representing Jesus Christ. Now, we weren't using it as an evangelism tool. I don't mean to imply that. But opening our doors, there was, in the midst of all the controversy, and it literally at times being yelled at and getting some very ugly communications, there was a kind of peace. And again, I would stress it's not about being arrogant or that, the right is all on our side and all the wrong on the other. But I just, this idea of first things first, what is it that's at the core? Okay, third question. Verse 29 and 30 say, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And my question is, in these two verses, Jesus invites us to take his yoke upon us because it is easy and light. How do you interpret and apply that message today? Now, as a child, when I would hear this or read it, it didn't make sense to me because in the larger circle of family, there were some people who literally were farmers and cattle raisers. And I literally got to see a couple of, I guess they weren't oxen, I don't know if they were horses or what. They were yoked together to pull a plow. And I thought, I don't want to do that. That image of being restrained and being made to work. So it's taken some life experiences and growth, hopefully, to learn about it. Now, a couple of quick comments. A yoke is a device for work, especially in tandem with others. Now, I suppose you could yoke one animal, but generally it's a symbol. There's work to be done. And I think this is along with, I started saying in contrast, it complements the verse we just looked at. There's rest, and what immediately follows the promise of rest? By the way, folk, you got work to do. Rest doesn't mean you stay in bed all day long. There's a sense of peace within you and purpose, and by the way, there's work to be done, and the yoke represents that. And a yoke also is a symbol of boundaries, but I would say it this way: a yoke limits but increases the effectiveness of the team. The team works better if they're yoked together, but there's a restraint in that. They are linked to each other. And it reminds me of the biblical invitation to bear one another's burdens. Some decades ago, there was a popular movement, I think it was referred to as T groups, where churches and businesses and other organizations had people together in a group led by a person, and they were exploring their feelings and relationships and so forth. And one of the exercises that was done in each of those groups that I participated in, and being often the biggest guy in the room, the leader would make his or her point by having me lie on the floor or on a table and saying to people, we need to pick him up. And he would get people to stand around me, 6 or 8, however many could get there, and put their hands under me and lift me. And then talk about how that felt. And here's a woman, 5'2", 90 pounds. And the point was, if you have to do it by yourself, you can't lift him. But if we together put literally our hands to the task, somehow it is bearable. Maybe a silly illustration, but it was powerful, especially the first time it happened. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, what if they slip and let me fall? Now, Charles, I read our notes from this passage in 2017, and I typed a quote from you that I'm going to use. You said, "The purpose of a yoke is not to be burdensome, but to enable greater functionality, to extend usefulness, so that the oxen will use energy effectively. A yoke is not meant to limit us, restrict us, but set us free to work well." That's well said, and I appreciated that, and I'm glad I typed that out.
I wrote something down as I was listening to this conversation that is quite like what apparently I said three years ago.
All right, Charles. Good. Thank you. Sara.
I will say that as a parent of teenagers who often don't want to do things by themselves are often encouraged to do things with me or with their father. So I'm offering up the idea that it's really difficult to alone know where to start a project, to know where to start the good work. So it helps to be partnered, yoked, with someone who might be more experienced, who might be a mentor and an advocate. So I liked the imagery of teaming together, and that Jesus is inviting us to put on the yoke with him and become a team with him, a partner in the work. So I liked that imagery a whole lot, and it meant a lot to me because I think as a community, that's what we're asked to do, to come alongside each other, to shore each other up, to provide sustenance or drink when a celebration needs to occur, so that we're not in the effort alone, but are in the community working together. I think that working with Jesus, I couldn't ask for a better working partner. He probably understands completely my strengths and weaknesses, and I don't need to articulate them, although it sometimes helps me to think about that. I can't imagine that there would be anybody more delightful to work with. I see glimpses of the sense of humor that God must have, expressed in the language he uses and how he talks to the people that we have biblical passages referencing to. So I wonder if there could be a better way to rest in the work, if that makes sense. I'm thinking of a very fine example from the movie Mary Poppins, when she encourages the children to clean up the playroom and sets magic loose in the room to help and assist with them cleaning things up, and makes it a game. And I think that's a huge, huge gift. To say, yes, we're going to do something hard, yes, we're going to do something that requires effort, but let's look at it from a perspective of it's healthy, it's fun, we can get it done together. And I think that's what we're actually looking at in this passage.
Don?
I was thinking about the tools that we use and how they're an extension of something. And it could be weights or pulleys and levers. It could be physician's tools, a scalpel, if you're a roofer, a nail gun or a shovel to remove the shingles. That we always taught it's an extension of ourselves. And I think back to science classes where we learn about those things and we learn about the physics of why we use tools in a certain way. And our teachers, my parents always say, well, it's an extension of yourself. It's something, it gives you strength to do something more. So I think if you're facilitating a class and you go in that direction, it's what's an extension of, and in this case, there are many yokes, but this is God's yoke. So it's not this yoke, it's a different kind of yoke. So whose is it and for what purpose is it being used? What is it an extension of? And in that way, it connects to the cities, mercy. It connects to the individual rest. And it connects to, when you look at it in your hand, a tool, for example, or even if you're a professional sports player, the baseball bat, whose is this? What is the purpose that it's there for? And I think there's a tradition that, at least in my life, that isn't as strong as it might have been 50 years ago, 100, 200 years ago, which was I think we used to meditate on those things. Pastor, I think we used to go and we would bless those things, the tools that we were given. We would give thanksgiving for the tools that we were given to serve because they were extensions of ourselves, and then the meditation was that they would be used in service, or they are things that are given to us to be able to have a mercy city or a mercy community. And I think it also, the tools are supposed to be fit for a particular purpose. They're supposed to be excellent. They use gospel language, right? They should be the most excellent tools. If you have an ox and you have a yoke, what is most excellent? Well, I want the ox to be there for many seasons to come, for many harvests. The ox will have rest. It will not be overburdened. I want the yoke to be so perfect that the job is done, the soil is turned, there will be crops, and next year, I want it to be a most perfect tool. And in that way, it allows us to think about the ecosystems that we're serving as well. And I'm thinking about, a tool fit for a particular purpose. And I'll go to Corinthians 12. Now that you're the body of Christ and each one of you is a part of it, think about tandem, Pastor. And God has placed in the church, first of all, apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, the gifts of healing, of helping, of guidance, the different kinds of tongues. Are the apostles, are all the prophets, are all the teachers, do all work miracles, do all have the gifts of healing, do all speak in tongues, do all interpret, and I eagerly desire the greater gifts. And that's where it goes right into the most excellent way. I will show you a new way, a most excellent way. So even if I might look at that shovel or that tool, it's like, well, this has been here a long time. This is the most excellent way to use it if you meditate on what a mercy community actually looks like. So I think there's a tradition of, blessing those tools and those instruments, which are an extension of our body. And then in the blessing, we say, well, wait a minute, that's not my body. That's the body of the body of Christ. That's a God tool. So that's what I was thinking about, Bill.
Good, thank you. One other thought, and then Charles, if you want to offer any more summary, I overlooked my note. Again, quoting Stanley Saunders, he suggests to us, and I find it helpful to consider, that the best image or summary of the yoke in Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount. It sets boundaries. It yokes us to the Spirit of Christ. So that was helpful to me, and I meditated on it, that talking about the limits that the yoke sets, no violence, for example, and it's about mercy and humility. So I found that helpful. So, Charles, were you waving me off? Do you have more to add before I hand it back to Don? You're muted.
You're on mute, Charles.
The world of Zoom.
I'm happy to give it back to Don.
Okay, Don, you're on.
Well, it's our tradition. To just double check to make sure there are not any final comments. Sarah, are you good?
I really liked your commentary about tools. That was really helpful.
That's an old tradition, kind of lost,
I will also there are a plethora of yoke jokes if we wanted to go there.
But you're not going there. Is that correct? You're not. This is Christian encouragement. You're not going there, are you? Please.
No, I was only yoking.
Oh, good one, Sarah.
Okay.
And I'm good, Don.
Thank you very much. So for folks listening in, we're glad you're here. And Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And if you're listening in pandemic conditions and if you're in a quarantine or some kind of lockdown, I commend that site to you because there will be other folks discussing the same passages, coming up with all kinds of other ideas and new ways to look at this or facilitate a discussion. You can find preaching, you can find meditations, discussion groups. So I commend that site to you in a time where you may not have normal access to going to a church or a discussion group. And you're always welcome, and we'll see you next time.